Hey guys, it's Adam here. Today to talk about annotated bibliographies. So first of all, welcome to week 12, almost done. 16 weeks total, so we're just about there. Four more weeks left, and we're out of here for a few weeks. So it gives us something to look forward to. Annotated bibliographies that we're going to talk about today are an important tool for getting to know the sources that you're going to be using for the papers that you write. I've found them very useful in the past as a way of trying to figure out what's useful for me and what's not. When you're doing searches for sources and looking through, there's thousands of titles of different things. A lot of times the title will look like it's going to be a great source for the subject that you're writing about, and then it turns out once you get into it that it may be a totally different subject, or vice versa. There could be something that you might think is not going to be such a good useful tool as a source, and then it turns out you base a lot of your paper on what's in that source. So annotated bibliographies give us a way of doing kind of like it's kind of like a preview of the source that we're going to use. So let's talk a little bit more about them. What is an annotated bibliography? I'm sure everyone knows what a regular bibliography is. I'm sure you've done plenty of works cited pages over the last year or two. Either works cited or a list of cited sources. And we're all pretty familiar with how to use like an MPA and APA format for doing these. What an annotated bibliography does is it goes a step further, and it kind of forces you to dive into that source a little more and get a little bit more information on it without actually sitting down and reading the whole thing. Maybe it's basically a summary of what that source is. So what's going to happen is it's going to start to look like, or the annotated bibliography will kind of look like a typical bibliography. So you're going to have your work cited there, but then afterwards you're going to describe that source in a number of different ways. So you're going to give the publication information and then evaluate the work for each of those sources that you're listing there. So let's take a look at how that works. There's a couple of different types. The first one is a descriptive annotation or descriptive annotations. So in this format, just like in all the others, you'd start out with the source cited, just like you would do when writing any other paper. Usually when you do, kind of as a side note, when you do an annotated bibliography, usually your instructor, or even if you're just doing it for yourself, you're only going to be doing that. So you're not going to have a paper ahead of it like you would with a normal works cited page. This is just a separate tool or a separate exercise that helps you figure out if those sources are going to be good sources or not. And with the descriptive annotations, basically going to summarize the contents of the work, but at this point you're not evaluating it at all. You're not going to give your own opinion or say how it might help your paper. So here's a couple examples on the side right here, straight out of your book. And as you can see, there's just a normal works cited at the top here. I don't know if you can see my cursor on here, but then afterwards there's just a single sentence describing what that source is. So as you can see down here, like line 4, a historical discussion of the identification of teenagers as a targeted film market. Simple sentence that just very briefly says what that source is about. And again, as you can see, there's 2 on this page. So one single source with a short description. It's pretty easy, pretty straightforward, not hard to do at all. It's not as time consuming as some of the other kinds we're going to look at in a second. And also, as you can see, it's there's 2 on this page. So again, very short, straightforward, and nothing about like your own opinion or how it's going to help your paper at all. It's just telling you simply what the source is. The other type is an evaluative annotations. So as you can see, this is one single annotation, and it's quite long. It's almost a page long, maybe 20 lines. And in this case, aside from describing what the publication or the source is about, you're going to offer your own opinions on the source and also describe it. So one of the ways, I don't think they say anything about this in this book, but a method that I've kind of used in the past is three sentences in 3 different paragraphs. Easy to remember. If for some reason your professor doesn't, or whoever you're writing this for doesn't give you direct guidance on exactly how many words or how much you're supposed to write, that's kind of a good baseline to start with. Okay, so it's just about 9 sentences. You can do 3 different paragraphs. And then let's look here on what maybe some of these paragraphs would be about. Okay, one of the things that I guess I probably should have brought up earlier is a statement of scope. So at the beginning of your annotated bibliography, they're wanting you to do a short sentence on what the scope of this is. So basically it's so that someone who picks up your annotated bibliography and starts reading through it isn't just seeing sources with a list of all your comments underneath and descriptions. They get a 1 sentence or a 1 paragraph overview on why you're actually looking at these. So it's basically to just give the reader an idea of why you're pulling up these sources and annotating them. Okay, and so that would just be the very beginning. And then as we go into it, the next thing is alphabetically, just like a normal bibliography, you will have your citation there. So you'll start out with the citation. After that, you'd give a concise description of that work. So this is the first paragraph that we were talking about earlier, maybe a summary of what's going on. And then you're going to have your relevant commentary. So this is going to be why this is a good source for you. Okay, so that would be probably like your second paragraph. And then the third paragraph that I always like to include is how it's going to help you in your paper, how it's why that source is going to be a useful source for what you're writing about. And it's also possible that you get to this point and you realize that maybe this is not a good source for you. Like I was saying earlier, some titles can come up and look like they're going to be great, a great source for the paper that you're writing, and it turns out that they're not really all that, they're not well researched, or maybe it's totally a different subject than you actually needed. Could be a number of different reasons why a source isn't good. So again, it's never set in stone. Everything's a draft until you turn in your final paper. But this is just and honestly, the annotated bibliography probably is usually a separate assignment than your actual final paper. And most professors just use it as something earlier that they can do before you turn in your final paper, so that you can actually walk through these motions of, checking out all your sources and seeing if they're going to be good for you or not. So, and it also could turn out that maybe what was your primary source becomes your secondary source, or something else that you thought you were probably going to throw out may turn out to be like the one great source that you base most of your paper on. So it's a good way to just get an idea for what you're going to be basing your paper on. And then the last thing on here is consistent presentation, and this is just kind of for how your annotated bibliography looks. So just normal stuff that I'm sure you guys are aware of already. You wouldn't want to have different fonts, at different places in the bibliography. You'd probably want to make sure that you're doing spacing consistently throughout the whole paper. The other thing is making sure that you kind of want to try and give about the same amount of words to each source. So if you're given like 2 or 3 sentences to one maybe, and then a whole page to another one, it's probably not really balanced out, right? You want to make sure that you're giving the same amount of information to each one. All right, let's look at some of the tips for writing one of these things. And I'm sure you've been hearing this all semester long. I probably shouldn't even bring it up, but again, the main thing that you always got to keep in mind is who's your audience and what's the purpose of your paper. If you start going down the road of pulling up sources under totally different subjects, it could end up being a waste of a lot of your time. So just keep that in mind. Who are you writing to, and what's the purpose of your paper? So next one is deciding on the sources, and this is probably the most important part of the whole thing, because you want to make sure you have good sources for your paper. The first one is the obvious one, and that's the appropriateness. So again, this is going to be if you want to make sure that this source is something that's useful to you. If it's not, you're just wasting your time reading through it and citing it. And I know we've all been in the place where you pull a bunch of sources and you're writing your paper, the night before it's due, and you're like, you end up looking at something and you're like, well, I put it in my works cited already, and you have to cite it. You go in there and you try and find some sentence that maybe kind of works because you're required to have 3 or 4 sources or 5 sources. So we've all probably had to do that before. But if you can look at this ahead of time and do an annotated bibliography long before you're writing your paper, you can kind of weed out some of those sources that probably are not appropriate, and it gives you time to go find something that is. All right, credibility is another very important thing. We can, any of us can go Google any subject we want anytime, day or night, and all kinds of things are going to come up. Thousands of different websites, thousands of different sources. But if we're just going straight off of the Google machine, probably a lot of stuff that comes up is not going to be credible. So an easy way to make sure that what you're using is credible is using some of the search engines that the library gives to us, like the databases and like the JSTOR and a lot of the things with more professional journals and things like that. So bottom line is usually if you're pulling something off the library website, the UH library website, you're in good shape. But if you're just Googling something or pulling articles off of Facebook or Instagram or something, you might want to look a little more into that. Balance is another important one. If you're looking at a source, you want to make sure that, kind of like when we were writing your own paper, you want to make sure that you balance the opinion. So if the source that you're using is arguing for a specific thing, you want to make sure that they're also looking at the reasons or the arguments against that thing, if that makes sense. So if you're arguing, if the paper that you're using is arguing for like a specific thing, say if they're saying for global warming or something like that, you want to make sure that they're anticipating in their source any arguments that could be against that and then arguing against them. So it kind of goes with the credibility thing, because if it's a credible source, they're going to understand, whoever's writing will probably understand that there's arguments against it too. So otherwise there's no controversy there. And the last thing is timeliness. And this is something that I've ran into trouble with before too. You find a perfect source, you're sitting there digging through the database and it's exactly what you need. And then you realize that it was written 50 years ago or something. So it's still, you could still use it as a good source. It depends on the situation. If you're writing something about technology and how that changes, probably older sources are not going to work so good. If you're writing about, say, like a literature analysis, if you're doing a research paper describing an old piece of literature, then maybe it's not as big a deal. But timeliness is very important. Make sure you're looking at the dates that are on those journals or whatever sources you're using. All right, and then the other question is, should it be descriptive or should it be to evaluate? Those two different types that we looked at before. So for you guys, this is probably going to depend mostly on what your professor wants you to write, what they're trying to see, what they're trying to have you do with it. If for some reason you're doing this on your own for yourself, as you get further along in college, you're just going to have a paper assignment. There's not going to be not going to break it down into each little annotated bibliography or literary assessment or all these little things. It'll just be end of the class, papers due. So in that situation, you could use an annotated bibliography to figure out what your sources are going to be early in the semester or early before the paper is due. So if you're doing it for yourself, an evaluative annotated bibliography is probably the best way for you to figure out what sources you want to use for that paper. A descriptive one might be more of an exercise for looking up sources and defining them for your instructor possibly, or maybe if you're working in a group and you're looking through like tons and tons of different sources, a descriptive might be a faster way to look at a whole bunch of sources and figure out what you got to use. So just different purposes, different tools. Reading carefully is of course important. You're obviously not going to be able to read, especially if it's a long paper, you're not going to be able to read the whole thing. And at this point, if you haven't even started your paper yet, it's not worth your time to read through the whole thing. You'll probably just be scanning it and then doing a quick summary and then an evaluation. So in any case though, ensuring that you read through some of it, or at least the important part for what your paper is and so that you get a good idea of how to write out that annotation. And then the other thing is if it's necessary, you might want to research the writer. If it's someone who might sound sketchy, or I don't know if you've ever looked up an article and the author is like some weird name that's obviously made up, or it looks like it's made up, you might want to just search them a little and see what other papers they've published or other books they've published. And then summarizing your work. Again, this is just you're going to bring together everything that you've looked into and make sure you keep it short. You're not writing a whole paper on the source. Just keep that in mind, especially if you're getting frustrated. It doesn't have to be really long. You just want it to accurately summarize the work that you're doing. And then finally, evaluating the usefulness for your project and their stance. So this, we actually kind of already talked about it. It basically, is it appropriate for what you're writing? If it's not useful for you, get rid of it immediately, because you just don't want to waste time when you have more important things to do. And finally, it's possible that it is appropriate, but the stance is not what the stance that the author is trying to argue may not be the direction that you want to go. If that makes sense, it's kind of like the vision that the author is putting forward on the paper, what their direction is on that. So that could be and have impact on whether or not you use that source also. All right, then I always like looking at these. They have them at the end of the chapter. I guess I'm kind of a visual person, so I like to see, how these things are laid out. I always like to do a good outline or something similar to this before I even start doing any kind of project. And so these are two different types of methods for annotated bibliographies. The first one is just probably the normal type that you'll be writing. The second one down below is for multiple categories. So as you can see on the first one, it starts out with where you state the scope. And again, this is like a paragraph at the top where you're describing why you're going to use these next entries. So it just again gives the reader or your professor, whoever's looking at these, an idea of why you're looking at these sources and what you're trying to get out of them, so that they know ahead of time what they're getting into. And then, as you can see, after you state the scope, you just kind of go through what we already talked about. And again, it's all going to be alphabetical order, just like you would do a regular bibliography. You list the first entry, and then you put your annotation below it. And so this could be for either type of annotated bibliography. If it's descriptive, it's going to be probably a little bit shorter. So, and then you just continue on down that list. Okay, typically, you'll have a minimum of 3 of these that you'll have to do. If you're doing an annotated bibliography, like I think you're doing this week, as kind of an exercise to practice how to do it, your professor might give you a couple more sources that you have to use. But typically, it's 3 to 5 with most college papers. The second one underneath is for multiple categories. So it's basically the same thing, except you'll state your scope basically for each category. So you'd have an overview where you're stating your scope and saying what those categories are. And then you start with category 1, explain that category, and then do all your entries, just like we did up above. And then you'll start your second category. Then you list your entries alphabetically, again, under that category, not as a total, just in that category, and then annotate them underneath that too. So this is probably something where if you have a paper or something where you're going to have multiple subjects, say you're arguing one point strongly and then another point strongly, and then bringing them all together at the end, you might have 3 categories there. It's also possible, for whatever reason, you're writing a paper on two different things that happen to be in the same paper, then this would be a method that you'd use there too. But it's nothing crazy to figure out. It's basically the same method, just split up into a couple of different categories. So nothing crazy there. All right, that's about all I have for you on this one. So this was chapter W14 in the book. If you haven't read it already, it's short. You can get through it pretty quick, maybe 5-10 minutes. So, but it's going to be helpful with the assignments that you're doing. Again, if you guys ever end up with any questions, email me or Dylan or the professor anytime you want. We're always here for you. And that's probably going to do it for this today. We'll probably see each other on Friday, but if not, enjoy the rest of your week. See you guys.